You know, part of Buddhism has been reflecting on what's good about our lives as well as what's difficult. And so to feel gratitude and to actually cultivate gratitude is a very legitimate part of the practice as well. Rather than seeing what's missing, to see what's actually there. And that lunch was very there for me, so that was great. Okay. So we come to the third part of the day, the after lunch part. Moving to the third noble truth. And the third noble truth simply is about what's called the cessation or the ceasing, the stopping of suffering. And particularly referring here to the suffering produced by the way we relate to our experience, what we're doing with our experience, our reactions, and our lack of understanding about what's actually going on underneath our normal habitual way of doing things. The question, of course, is how do we come to stopping suffering? How do we make it slow down? How do we see it more clearly? How do we release around it? I said this morning, this would form the second half of the day. We've already touched on it a little, and we'll keep going with that. So there are a number of practices that help us to understand how to move towards the cessation of suffering. Most of these practices are built around noticing our experience as process rather than content. So noticing the story rather than being in the story. So when we have our habitual thoughts, reactions, memories, our anger at the driver who won't go fast enough in front of us, those sorts of things, we're in the story. We are the story. Now, we don't want to say here that being in the story is necessarily a bad thing and we should be mindful and aware all the time. But nevertheless, if we're in the story the whole time, again, we can get to the end of our life and really have missed a lot of what's gone in our lives and maybe be hurting more than when we started. In modern mindfulness movements, this is called being on autopilot. So autopilot is when we're just habitually doing the same things over and over again. So the example I always give is most of us, if we work or go to university or study or do something, we will travel from point A to point B on a regular basis. And in the afternoon we go from point B to point A to return home. And we do that a lot. Do you ever notice what happens? Have you ever had this experience? You get to work and you go, holy hell, how did I get here? I can't remember. You know, we haven't noticed anything. We don't necessarily want to say that's a bad thing because reflection and thinking and being involved in creating is also incredibly important. But there's a question mark about how often we want to be on autopilot. The autopilot's quite useful for things like driving, for example. You know, I've got a car that is a manual car, so I change gears. I don't want to be a learner driver for the rest of my life, thinking about how do I change gears? Oh, where's first gear? There's lights. I have to stop neutral. Or, you know, I want to be able to just get that as part of a sort of implicit memory where it just happens, like riding a bike. You know, it just happens for you, and off you go. So autopilot is extraordinarily useful for regular habitual things we don't really need to be consciously thinking about. However, for things we do want to be involved in and present to, like eating, for example, we may want to learn how to choose to be present to that, lest we get to the end of our lives again and we've tasted only, a quarter of our meals or something like that. We go to do something, we have the intention of being present and really fully enjoying it, and we find ourselves wandering off all the time. In fact, human beings wander off all the time, we just don't notice. So we have some choice over not wandering off and noticing the process of what's actually going on, rather than just always being in the story that's being generated, that we've always just followed through. That's usually very deeply entrenched in us. This is the story of Michael. This is me. I'm a meditation teacher and I can sit for X number of hours and I'm a Vipassana practitioner and this, that and the other thing. We get very attached to that, and we get very attached to this sense of self, which is a story. The self is a story. It's many, many stories, don't you think? We are our own narrative, our own story, and we're deeply attached to and protective of that particular story. We're wanting to be somebody. And we tend not to see that's a process, and so we don't really have much choice about how to alter the story. If I'm very invested in presenting myself to you as Michael the tremendous meditator, then I have to be a tremendous meditator, at least in your eyes. I've got to be sitting up and being seen in a certain sort of way. That's a very habitual response, is to present ourselves in a way that we're seen. We want to be that story. We want to be something. The Buddha said that's one response, that's one sort of story. The other sort of story is the desire not to be seen, to hide, to not be noticed. And the third sort of story that's predominant, the Buddha said, is this desire to be caught up in the sensual world, the world of experience and taste and touch and smell and the whole thing, and to get lost in that as well. Just on that first one, the desire to be, just thinking that through as an example, I think the modern desire to be, the story of the self, is about becoming famous. I think it used to be about being rich, and probably still is to some extent, but I actually think it's about being famous. Look at all the shows on television or social media that are about people seeing us in a certain sort of way. And I find that extremely interesting. Famous for being famous is the phrase, isn't it? There's nothing underneath it, really. Just present yourself in a certain way, you catch people's attention and you're famous. And it feels to me almost like, if I have enough people who see me in that way, then I can relax. Then I'll really be that person. I really will be that sort of person I crave to be. The issue is that sort of story is dependent on conditions. It's always dependent on other people giving us back what we want. So, if a few of you are looking at me going, this guy's a bit dodgy, he doesn't really know what he's talking about, and I'm trying to present an image of me, I'm trying to be famous in your eyes and get you looking back at me in a certain way, I'm going to be really extraordinarily disturbed about that. That I'm not getting what I want. It's upsetting my self-image. It's upsetting my self-story. All of us have self-stories. Many, many self-stories according to the context that we're in, work, home and so forth. Buddhism says, let's step back for a moment and check out these stories and see how deep they go, how real they are. Let's see whether they lead to suffering or to happiness. Let's see whether they're for our long-term benefit or not, rather than short-term gain. So there's a number of practices we have to do that, to arrive at this cessation of suffering. And one that you'll be familiar with is a walking practice, walking meditation. I'm going to get us out and doing some walking meditation in a moment, just for 10 or 15 minutes. But I want to read you something about it first, and then I want to give you a little practice you can do with it that you might find very helpful. And it's a practice then you can take and use outside of the walking practice as well. And of all the mindfulness classes I've ever run, this is probably the practice I'm about to introduce to you in a minute that people see as the most helpful, as a really good starting point. But let me read you something about walking meditation first. This is from a teacher called Thich Nhat Hanh, who lives in Plum Village in France, very elderly now. And this book is called Present Moment, Wonderful Moment. Here's a score of writings, very beautiful. And some beautiful poetry as well. I won't read you all of it, but he talks about walking meditation. He says, walking meditation can be very enjoyable. We walk slowly, alone, with friends, if possible in some beautiful place. Walking meditation is really to enjoy the walking. Walking not in order to arrive, but just for walking. Let's pause there for a moment. If we extend that further, how much of our lives are spent aiming at a goal and trying to get to somewhere, rather than occasionally, at the very least, being present to what's actually going on. We're very goal-oriented in all sorts of ways, whether it's about self-image or work or the amount of money we make or being a certain sort of person. Often we're aiming for the goal and missing the present moment. The purpose is to be in the present moment and enjoy each step you make. Therefore, you have to shake off all worries and anxieties, not thinking of the future, not thinking of the past, just enjoying the present moment. He says, our hurried steps print anxiety and sorrow on the earth. It's very beautiful. Our hurried steps print anxiety and sorrow on the earth. If we can take one step in peace, we can take 2, 3, 4, and then 5 steps for the peace and happiness of humankind. And he goes on to say, our mind darts from one thing to another like a monkey swinging from branch to branch without stopping to rest. Thoughts have millions of pathways, and we are forever pulled along them into the world of forgetfulness. If we can transform our walking path into a field for meditation, our feet will take every step in full awareness. Our breathing will be in harmony with our steps, and our mind will naturally be at ease. Every step we take will reinforce our peace and joy. The Buddha is often represented by artists as seated upon a lotus flower to suggest the peace and happiness he enjoys. Artists also depict lotus flowers blooming under the footsteps of the newly born Buddha. If we take steps without anxiety in peace and joy, then we too will cause a flower to bloom on the earth with every step. So you're right, it's beautiful, of course. I've actually done the walking practice where I've imagined that every step I take there is a flower blooming, and you walk very, very gently. It makes you very mindful. So with the walking practice, what we'll do in a moment, if Tina are here or someone who knows the area, there's a park in Stanley Street. Does anybody know? We've got to go out the front and back along just across the road, and we can walk in the park. We can walk in the car park if you want to, but the park is nicer. Does anybody know the way there? Or I can lead you. They've been there once. I'm sure I can do it again. What we'll do is go over there, and we'll just take 10 minutes to walk. You can walk. There are many different ways of walking. You can walk 10 steps, walk back 10 steps, you can walk around the park, just have a look around. What we're trying to do is stay present to where our mind is at. We're noticing, we're walking, our feet are touching the earth. There's lots to notice that'll help us be present. But the extra thing you can do here in this practice I think is quite useful is the stop practice. So stop is an acronym, S-T-O-P. And it goes like this. S is for stop. T is for take a breath. So stop, take a breath. The O is for open to experience, or if you like, observe the experience. Sometimes the experience is difficult, so we don't want to open to it, but we can observe has more of a clinical sort of sense, doesn't it? We're stepping back and we're just observing what's going on, witnessing what's going on. And then the P means proceed. Stop, take a breath, open or observe experience, then proceed. And we keep walking. Now you can do that for a few seconds, or you could do that for many minutes if you wanted to. And then we just keep walking. For me, I like, because I've been to Burma and trained in Burma, we tend to use the feet falling on the ground and moving through the air as our anchor point. But it really doesn't matter. You can use the breeze on your face, you can do listening as well as you're walking along, you're seeing beautiful things, perfectly fine, nothing wrong with beauty. But we want to be present in such a way that we're as little as possible getting caught up in the story of ourselves and lost in thoughts and memories and projections, because pretty soon we're not in the park at all and we're off somewhere in some sort of strife, or thinking we're back home or whatever it happens to be. So that's when we stop, take a breath, come back to the body, observe, well, what's going on in my body now? Okay, there's anxiety or happiness or fear or whatever it happens to be. There's touching sensations, there's the breeze, there's the coolness, lots of things to notice. It's very factual. It's just what's happening. And then we proceed, and we know we're proceeding. We use the walking to stay present. How does that sound? Is that okay? Yeah. And we can do this anywhere, walking to the bus, the train, down the, from the bedroom to the toilet in the morning, all sorts of places we can use this. So it's really portable. Our feet are nearly always touching the ground. Unless we're jumping for joy, our feet are nearly always touching the ground. So I want to read you a poem about stopping. And this tells you part of the purpose of the practice. It's called Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes me forever to find a way out. And clearly this is talking about our patterns, our habits, the way we work in the world, the way our minds work. 2. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. It's not there. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. 3. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it as there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. I get out immediately. It is my fault, it's my responsibility, I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street, there is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. First we have to see that we're in the hole, and mostly we see that we're in the hole to start with, don't we? We're in there already and it's hard to get out. This really speaks to something called dependent origination, which says there's a series of things that happen whereby we find ourselves in whatever our particular hole happens to be. We've usually got many of them, haven't we? First of all, there's an experience of some sort. We have contact with an experience like this. We have contact, we have hearing at the ear, don't we? From that, there's a feeling. Well, let's do this. Let your eyes close. I'm going to ring the bell. I want you to tell me what the process is that you go through, and we'll explore that. Eyes closed, and I'm going to let the bell ring, and for quite some... In fact, I'll ring it 3 times. Okay, you let your eyes open. What happened? What did you notice? What was the process for you as you were listening? Isn't it interesting, we've had different responses as well. So one thing isn't necessarily pleasant or unpleasant, it's sort of what we make of it. We bring our own readiness, our conditioning to that, and we make something of that. So that's very interesting that the fading away was pleasant. You've just described the process of awakening. The fading away, the putting down, the letting go is really pleasant. That's the mind gets calmer and calmer. So that's a great experience. Yeah, so on that experience, very simple. Clearly I rang a different bell at the end. Sometimes people are surprised by that and they find they have a little experience of shock. Or sometimes when I do this, people have a reaction to that and they find they're pulling back from it slightly. Or they love the sound of the bell and they're leaning in towards it. So there's a lot happening when we hear something. First of all, there's contact. Then there's usually a feeling, pleasant or unpleasant. The way I characterise that, certainly in meditation, is it feels like, oh, that's nice, I want to invite it in. Or we're sort of leaning into it a little bit. I like that. We lean into it. Or, if we don't like perhaps the harshness of the sound, that bit, we can find ourselves pushing, pulling back from it, or pushing it away. So there's that movement of the mind we talked about, the moving towards, the moving away, the wanting more or the wanting less. The unpleasant and pushing it away and moving away from it. These are very natural movements of the mind. There's nothing wrong with them. But what Buddhism and what meditation is trying to do is unpack that process. Not the story necessarily, the process of the story. We become observers of our own process. So there's a sort of a contact. It might be seeing, it might be hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, or something like thinking, for example. And then from feeling, we have what they call craving. We want more or less, which I've outlined hopefully fairly fully now. And from that becomes clinging. We want more, I want to hang on to it. And of course we've established that all things pass, just like the ringing of the bell. It comes up, it passes away, or it goes like this, and it passes away. You can't hang on to it. You can't hold it. And we can become angry, sad, depressed, regretful, annoyed that we can't hold on to these things. And yet, if we're able to take a more, a less emotional, more observational, more sort of a view with awareness, we can start watching an unpacking process. Where most of us try to start unpacking the process is when we're really already inside the story. We're deep in the hole. And we have to try and realise we're in the hole and climb our way out. What the meditation practice helps us to do is to see the hole before we fall in it. And then we can actually walk down another street. So this is one of the ways that we do this, by unpacking process, unpacking listening, for example. So having said all that, I'm going to ring the bell again, and I'll ring it 3 times, and I may or may not be tricky with the last one. We'll see how we go. And just really practice tuning in and listening as a process. So what we're doing really is 2 things. We're hearing and we're noticing our responses to that. So let your eyes close and we'll do that again. Okay, you can let your eyes open. People sometimes get annoyed at me because I make them open their eyes too soon, and they're just really enjoying riding along with the bell. And that's an interesting reaction to notice as well. What's that? I want more of it. I want more, and Michael's gotten in the way of me getting what I want. How was that experience for you? So you're noticing it as process, and that there's enjoyment. And again, there's nothing wrong with enjoyment. We just want to unpack the process, you know. Fantastic. And normally we'll notice something in the body as well about this too. Yeah. So the point about this was a few points, but one is we can use the meditation practice for any part of our sense experience, whether it's touch, sound, smell and so forth. It's just a matter of applying this principle, stopping, taking a breath, opening up to whatever we want to open up to, or just taking that broad sense of here I am, it's just like this. Noticing the process, either very minutely in the way that I've just described as contact and a feeling and a craving, clinging and so forth. Or just generally standing back and going, this is how I've woken up in the present moment. That's what I want, really. We'll use the meditation practice according to our own needs, really, and it depends on where we are. I want to talk then about another area that we can apply the meditation practice to, and this is one that really trips people up, and so I think this is hopefully very useful as well, and that's thinking. So we've covered the body, we've covered something like hearing, a sense door as it's called. I want to look at something more internal now, this process of thinking. So this is where we go back to our original stressor that you thought of. Nothing too difficult. Don't choose the most difficult stressor that you've got. And I want you just to think about that for a while. And just bring it to mind, put yourself back in the situation and think about it for a couple of minutes. And I want to comment on that. So we okay about that? Okay, so if you let your eyes close, and quite deliberately, as a reflective, contemplative practice, bring to mind one of the stressors you thought of this morning, one of the stressful situations. So imagine that you're back there, you're thinking about it, certain things are being said, you feel certain things. Try and feel that in the body, really thinking about and remembering where you're at. Okay, letting that go and letting the eyes open. I didn't do it for too long, I don't want us to get too stressed out thinking back to that. I've got a very simple question for you. How did you know you were thinking? Yeah, there's some sort of internal dialogue or monologue. And isn't it interesting, sometimes we think it's many voices, but actually usually it's ours. In fact, it's always ours, just in other people's mouths and so forth. Yeah, we're talking. That's one very predominant way of noticing that we're thinking. Other ways you knew you were thinking?
Picturing something.
Picturing some things. Still or moving?
Sorry?
Still pictures or moving pictures?
Moving. Yeah.
Left to right or right to left?
Yeah, like a movie.
Like a movie? Yeah. Oh, okay.
There's
Yes, yeah. Colour or black and white?
No color.
Colour. Okay. No colour. Of course. So they're two of the main ways of noticing that we're thinking, this simple thing of thinking. I've asked quite well-practiced meditators this question, and they've said, oh gosh, I don't know. So it's worth identifying the process again. Thoughts trap us because more than anything, thoughts plus feelings feels like me, doesn't it? And we take responsibility, which in a certain sort of way we should for our thoughts, but I wonder sometimes if we go too far and we take too much responsibility. That is, a thought pops into our mind, a thought or an emotion, and we do what I've talked about during the whole day. Oh, I'm a dreadful person. Look at me. I shouldn't be thinking this. Thank God nobody knows what I'm thinking. Or we go down the other end of the spectrum and go, this thought's fantastic. I'm much smarter than anybody else in this room. I know so much more about meditation. I hope they really appreciate it. And we walk down that path as well. But essentially, we come to believe that's me. We're so welded to thoughts, we don't even see them coming up very often. So part of the usefulness of meditation, mindfulness meditation practice, is we can start to see the emergence of thoughts and feelings. We're trying to get back to where it starts. Not to get rid of it, but rather to understand it and just see it as process. Thoughts, in some ways, are probably the trickiest because they're very, very fast. And because we identify with them so strongly, we often don't even know that we're thinking. We're walking along and 5 minutes later we sort of wake up and we've been on autopilot in a whole mass of thoughts. And we've been those thoughts. Remember the old Pac-Man games? With chomp, 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 chomp. Thoughts are chomping us, chomp, 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 like that. In fact, there's one of the early sutras, where the Buddha, I think, says one of the monks is being chewed by his thoughts. So I don't know if Pac-Man was around then or not, but chomp, chomp, chomp. So often we are being chewed and tormented by our thoughts, or led astray by them in ways that we really don't want to be led astray. But often our response is picking up a stick and beating ourselves up, or sort of polishing our medals on our chest, one of those two reactions, because we haven't seen the danger in doing that. So we can even unpack thoughts as process as well. We can also use a form of thinking, I suppose, in our meditation practice, and this is for people with anxiety or particularly strong reactions that happen. This can be quite useful, and it's the practice of labeling. So when I was in Burma, the practice I did there was naming what was going on, labeling, noting what was going on. And very specifically, they would note the rise and the fall, the various aspects of that as a meditation practice. But what we can do is actually use the same practice and apply it to any part of our experience, whether it's thinking, whether it's feelings, whether it's bodily sensations, whether it's even being with other people. What we can do is silently and as accurately as possible name what's going on. There's a child psychiatrist in the States called Dan Siegel, and he calls that process name it to tame it. We don't really want to tame it in a way, we're not trying to get rid of it, but we're trying to uncover what's actually going on. So when we have a thought or a feeling, we name it. So a thought comes up and we just go thinking, 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 thinking. Or we have an emotion, sadness, sadness, sadness. It's very important to get quite a clear label. It doesn't have to be entirely accurate, but there's got to be this on-looking quality. We're putting the post-it note on it as it goes past. Thinking, thinking, thinking. You know little post-it notes? We can stick those on. Thinking, 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 feeling, feeling. We're not trying to push them away, but we are doing what they call decentering, creating a space between us and what's going on. So we're touching it, but we're not dragged down into the whirlpool of that particular emotion or carried away with it into flights of fancy. So labelling is an incredibly powerful practice. There's there was some research done some time ago with a whole lot of people, and what they had to do was quite simple. They were shown a whole lot of images of a man and a woman. Let's call them Harry and Sally. And Harry and Sally had all these sorts of expressions on their face: sadness, happiness, anger, and so forth. And the people had two tasks. The first task was simply, as the faces were flashed up on the screen, they had to say, oh, that's Harry or that's Sally, and I guess they'll press the appropriate button. That's one. And in the second task, they had to label the emotion they thought that was being expressed on Harry and Sally's face, or Sally's face. What they found, because I'm measuring what was going on in the brain at this stage, was when people named them Harry or Sally, and that's all, they got very similar sorts of reactions in accordance with what they saw on people's faces. They became aroused, agitated in relation to that. Interestingly, when they had to label, that naturally seemed to dampen that agitation of the mind. So name it to tame it. It's not that they pushed it away. In fact, quite the reverse. In a sort of a way, they went towards it because they had to name it. But in naming it, it calls on another part of the brain, this frontal part of the brain, this thinking part of the brain, if you like. And so the thinking part of the brain moderates this emotional sort of centre part of the brain, if I can put it that way, and moderates the response just simply by labelling. So it's really important. We're not trying to shut it down. We're not trying to push it away, which is just another reaction. We certainly don't want to get caught up in it. The labelling gives clarity and a way of being present and not being caught up. So I thought we might do a little bit of labelling as maybe one of our final meditation practices. So the labelling, the stop practice can be quite powerful, and you can label at any time. So I think what we will do, if it's okay with you, is go back to your stressor once more. We're getting quite familiar with it now. And what we're going to do is bring it to mind for a few minutes. Try and be there. And then what I would like you to do is simply to label silently and just to yourself what's going on. A little tip: if you're having a feeling, or at that time you had a feeling, try not to use the word I, because that personalises it. That naturally sort of contracts the mind around a sense of me. And rather you might use a phrase like there is. There is sadness, happiness, anger, rage, fear. You can even make a longer label if it helps. There is an experience of fear. You can put a whole sentence on it, because it takes more mental energy to do that, and that gives us naturally more distance from the thing itself. But a simple one-word label might be helpful for you as well. So let's see how we go with that. We'll do this for a few minutes. So let your eyes close and maybe sit up and be a bit bright in the body and the mind. And a few breaths. Let's work towards just getting the mind and body reasonably calm to start with. So the in-breath and the out-breath. And the release. Choosing to bring attention to the breathing to begin with. And now very gently and carefully bringing to mind the stressful situation that you've identified previously. And once again imagining that you're there, whoever else was involved was there, is there. Thinking of what was said and what you said. Or feeling the feelings that you felt at that particular time. And as you move more clearly into that experience, beginning to label silently and to yourself what you're noticing, whether it be thinking, feeling, body sensations, even words we can label as talking, or hearing. And for a few minutes, let's just try labelling as specifically as possible all that we notice in that experience as we go over it and over it. There is a feeling of, there is a thought. And each time the mind wanders away, bring it back and bring back to mind this experience. Try to see if one word suits you as a labelling practice or a whole sentence. So letting go now of that experience, coming back to the breathing. Just the in-breath and the out-breath. Releasing, letting go, letting be. Whether the breath is long or short, deep or shallow. Releasing, letting be. So thank you. And response to that? Yeah, so the question is, how can we differentiate between non-judging and labeling? And my feeling is that the judging that's being talked about is getting caught up in judgment. Remember I said don't get caught up judging the judgments, judging the thoughts. So labeling is a judgment, there's no doubt. Because we have to perceive it, we have to pull it together and create a framework and we put a label on it. It's definitely a cognitive, conceptual process, there's no doubt. But it's not the same as, oh, and that's dreadful that I'm having that feeling. It's dreadful that I had that thought. It's dreadful that I said that. It's dreadful that whatever else. Rather it's just saying, this is what I'm noticing and this is the label that's most appropriate for that. It's a way of staying present. So yes, it's a form of judging, thinking, observing and noticing, but I guess it's the difference between judging and judgmental. And the issue here is with something like being judgmental, we're usually very caught up in a view about how things are, how they should be, why they shouldn't be that way, they should be that way, and that's when it all starts to spin out of control. Labelling should not spin us out of control. Quite the reverse. Is that okay? Yeah. There's a clarity around it, please.
So Cynthia, what you're saying is judge without guilt or blame?
You could say that, sure, absolutely, yes, yeah. I mean, probably another word, a different word than judge would be useful, I think. But you could certainly say that, as long as we understand what we mean by the word judge there. Yeah, to observe, to discern, where you have discernment. Oh, it's just like this. And there's not a lot of extra emotion attached to it. Yes, acknowledgement's a great word. Yeah, and that's the word I came up with. That's right. Yes. Thank you for saying it back to me. Yes, acknowledge, exactly, acknowledge. And it's a practice, you don't have to use it, it's just a practice some people have found useful. And certainly over the years I've been teaching this, people have found that a fairly useful practice, and certainly research seems to back that up as well. Quite powerful. And it gives us something extra to do. Sometimes meditation, formal meditation, can feel a bit passive. And if we're prone to either depression or anxiety or some other sorts of difficult states of mind, the doing practice can be a bit easier, such as the walking, labelling and so forth. Eating practice, as we did earlier on too. Well, we've got another doing practice coming up, and for this you will need a sheet of paper. This is the where to from here section. And do you know, Buddhism has a where to from here section as well in the fourth noble truth. It's the number 4. There's a path of practice. It's the how do I do this, how do I put it together, how do I sustain it. Where to from here, Buddha? Well, this is the where to from here for us today. So what I'm going to ask you to do is simply to think back to any normal given sort of day, and from the time you wake up, just very briefly, quick note, write down all the things that happen from when you wake up in the morning to getting to work and through work. Now this could take us a whole day to write out in real time, so we're not going to get very far into it, but you wake up, you stretch, you get out of bed, try and be reasonably specific as you go through. Try and get yourself to work at least, and some way into work, okay? So let's take just a few minutes to write that. Just make little notes down the page. Just a typical day for you. Okay, it doesn't really matter where you're at now. What I would like you to do, the second part of this exercise, is just to write a small lowercase m for mindfulness, lowercase m, next to any activity on that sheet where you think you could be mindful. So if you'd like to go through and do that now. Who's getting a lot of M's appearing on the page? Yeah, pretty much everything. Because if we can be mindful of the body, the mind, relationships, walking, eating, internal, external, past and future, it's very hard to think of anything where you couldn't be mindful. Can anybody think of anything where you can't be mindful?
Only sleeping.
Sleeping would be good. But there is dream yoga apparently, so you know. My teacher in Burma used to say reading, and I guess that if you're fully involved in something, it would be much harder to have that broad awareness of something, yeah. Okay, so pretty much anything. This is, funnily enough, this is where the practice goes astray in everyday life. Because it's so broadly applicable that what do we do with it? So, getting back to where we started this morning, I would like you to choose the one thing, the one part of your day where you can be mindful and will be mindful, and put a capital M next to it, maybe even circle it. So choose one that you're going to walk out from here, should you want to, and practice mindfulness every day. Is there one activity on that sheet where you think, yes, I think I could do that, that would be helpful? Can I ask you if anybody's bold enough to say, what if you chose it? Yeah, please. Okay, so remembering to wake up, to literally wake up. Yeah, right. Yeah. So remember, that's an intention to wake up then. Okay, yeah. Well, let me read you something about stopping at the lights. You may have already heard this. This is from Thich Nhat Hanh again. Thank you for setting that up again. That's great. Perfect. We didn't work it out beforehand. Funny enough, this is called driving the car. It's great. Before starting the car, I know where I am going. The car and I are one. If the car goes fast, I go fast. And he goes on to say, in another book I explain these 4 lines. If we are mindful when we start our car, we will know how to use it properly. When we are driving, we tend to think of arriving, and we sacrifice the journey for the sake of the arrival. Isn't that true of most of our lives? But life is to be found in the present moment, not in the future. In fact, we may suffer more after we arrive at our destination. If we have to talk of a destination, what about our final destination, the graveyard? We do not want to go in the direction of death, we want to go in the direction of life. But where is life? Life can be found only in the present moment. Therefore, each mile we drive, each step we take, has to bring us into the present moment. This is the practice of mindfulness. When we see a red light, or a stop sign, we can smile at it and thank it, because it is a bodhisattva, that is a being on the way to enlightenment, a bodhisattva, helping us return to the present moment. The red light is the bell of mindfulness. We may have thought of it as an enemy preventing us from achieving our goal, but now we know the red light is our friend, helping us resist rushing and calling us to return to the present moment, where we can meet with life, joy and peace. Even if you are not the driver, you can help everyone in the car if you breathe and smile. A number of years ago, I went to Canada to lead a retreat, and a friend of mine took me across the city of Montreal. I noticed that every time a car stopped in front of me, excuse my French coming up, I saw the sentence "Je me souviens," I remember, on the license plate. I did not know what they wanted to remember, but perhaps their French-speaking origin, but it gave me an idea. I told my friend, I have a present for all of you here. Every time you see a car stop in front of you with the line, "Je me you can see it as the bell of mindfulness, helping you remember to breathe and smile. And you'll have plenty of opportunities to breathe and smile while driving in Montreal, i.e. lots of red lights. My friend was delighted. He liked it so much that he shared the practice with more than 200 people in the retreat. Later, when he came to visit me in France, he told me that Paris was not a good place to practice driving, as there were no signs. Okay. I told him that he could practice with red lights and stop signs. After he left Plum Village and went back to Montreal, he wrote me a beautiful letter. Tay, practicing in Paris was easy. Not only did I practice with red lights and stop signs, but every time a car stopped in front of me, I saw the eyes of the Buddha blinking at me. I had to smile at those blinking eyes. The next time you are caught in traffic, don't fight. It is useless to fight. If you sit back and smile to yourself, you will enjoy the present moment and make everyone in the car happy. The Buddha is there because the Buddha can always be found in the present moment. Practicing meditation is to return to the present moment in order to encounter the flower, the blue sky, the child, the brilliant red light. So what I do when I get to red light, because I'm an impatient driver and I fight against the red lights, so I do stop, I do take a breath, I do observe what's going on. I keep my eyes open, of course. And then when the light changes, at the very least I'm less stressed. But I've been observing a process, and the process is changeable. The irritation disappears very quickly, and it's just like this, coming and going. And then I'm much more ready to proceed and not be in an accident as I go on down the road. So the red lights are extraordinarily useful, combined with the stop practice. What do red lights mean? Stop. So they're reminding us about the stop practice. So, you know, as you drive out from here, or somebody's driving you, or on the bus, you can always use this practice as well. One last thing I'd like you to do is to think about your stressful situation, or the ones you generated this morning, and now just to contemplate, is there one of the practices we talked about, or can you draw an idea from the practices that we've covered today that will speak to that stressful situation? The red lights are really like primary school in a way. That's the easy bit. That's the toe in the water. The stressful situation is the university. If we can graduate that, we've really fully graduated with a PhD. So is there a practice, and this is not for you to share with me, is there a practice that when you walk out of here today, you can think, okay, when that ongoing chronic stressor, not acute stress, but chronic stressor, when that comes up, is there a practice here that might help me either before, during, or after that chronic stressor? Have a think about that for a second. And if something comes to mind, I really invite you to write that down as well. It helps to write it down. It helps increase our intention and motivation to do that. Let's just take a minute or so to do that. We're drawing to a close of the day now. There are many aspects to the path, as I mentioned. We've just covered a few of them, particularly via the Four Noble Truths, looking at dukkha, stress, unsatisfactoriness, and looking at mindfulness as well, various aspects of mindfulness. There's much more in the path, of course, but one of the really vital parts of the path is how we share this process and who we share it with. The Buddha's chief attendant, Ananda, once said, you know, good relationships, friendships, that's a part of the holy life, the spiritual life. The Buddha actually said to Ananda, no, don't say that, it's the whole of the holy life. The whole of the spiritual life is the friendships that we have. Those good, nurturing, wholesome, to use a word that came up earlier today, wholesome friendships. I think there are lots of reasons for that, but friends support us on the path, they help us in the daily practice, they help us in viewing things in certain sorts of way, they help to bring back to mind those intentions that we brought up today. Places like the Metta Centre are fantastic. I think it's an eclectic centre. There's lots going on here, lots of people from different Buddhist traditions. And so finding a group of people, a supportive group of people, whether they're Buddhist or not, that can help you to cement these practices in place, to grow in the practice is incredibly important. And so coming to a place like this and sharing, even in perhaps the small way that we've done today, is a part of the spiritual life, a very legitimate part of the spiritual life. So I encourage you to, find people who can support you in carrying through on the intentions you've formulated today and to deepen the practice we've done. And I think I'd really like to finish just with a very short practice before we go out. And so let's do that and pop those things to one side. We'll just allowing the eyes to close or half close, and quite consciously sitting in a way that's dignified, that's upright, that allows the body and mind to settle. We choose to sit in a certain sort of way. And noticing the breathing coming in and out. Just the natural breathing. Letting go of any stresses or burdens. The desire to be anybody or particularly get anywhere. Just our present experience. Allowing ourselves to dwell on the day and anything that's happened or has come to mind that's helped us, that's assisted, that's made us feel joyful or happy, relieved. The Buddha praised joy and happiness as being conducive to the spiritual path. So if there's something that's happened today, conversation we've had, a meditation that's helped us to settle, to open, to feel happier, more joyful, we can bring that to mind and quite consciously see how that feels in the body. The pleasure of sharing the day with like-minded people. Perhaps a sense of warmth or expansion, an opening of the heart. Or just a general sense of happiness. And allowing ourselves to feel good about the practice we've done today, the effort that we've put in. The Buddha praised what he called right effort. Spending time with spiritual companions. Investigating our own processes, not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of those around us, the people we know here today. If we've helped them, we can feel pleased about that. And having the intention to go forward and share some of this, of what we've learned today, with our friends and family, not necessarily by words, but by actions. A sense of openness, kindness, and care. But remembering in the process to care equally for ourselves, to bring the same kindness and compassion to ourselves as we share with others. Resting in these qualities of the heart, openness, kindness, compassion. And just allowing ourselves to be for a few moments. Kindness, openness, compassion. So thank you all so much